Building upon our conversation of entrepreneurship is Andy Tai, Head of Media and Technology Southeast Asia at Goldman Sachs Investment Banking Division. He'll be sharing more with us on the startup landscape when it comes to mobility investments. Welcome again, Andy, and thank you for taking time to be with us today.
Hi there. Thanks for having me on as well.
Hi, I hope you've had your lunch because we have some loaded questions for you.
Yes. I'll prepared. Hopefully, I'll try my best.
Just kidding. Now, this is probably an area you know very well. For starters, could you share your broader thoughts on the mobility landscape? Kind of specifically the global landscape versus Asia and even nuances within Asia itself. What are some key
Sure.
changes you see?
So I think I take a step back. I would say, in terms of mobility, this is a ever evolving and dynamic sector that, as a firm and myself, we are very focused on. Right. It impacts daily lives, impacts user behaviors. And I think more importantly, for us, as we think about technology and kind of disruption, mobility obviously is one of the key sectors that, like I said, dynamic and continually being disrupted all the time. So the question then is, for people sitting around, how do we catch up with all the changes across the world? And I think particularly in globally as well, as we kind of things catch up, is you have regulations catching up, but more importantly, the technology is changing. We do kind of feel like a lot of the technology and innovation kind of happens, I think, from in the geographical standpoint, a lot of it still more out the west, given that especially on the west coast in the US, there's a very strong technology background, engineering background. So I would say a lot of that technology, in my mind, is constantly being evolved and innovated in the US. And I think the other market that, from a global standpoint, that continues to be very interesting is obviously China as well. Same thing, you have large population, high population density. So in terms of innovation for mobility, that's obviously very important. And to your point about then how does that actually affect us, in Singapore and things like that, is I think particularly for Singapore, then is one hand is looking at case studies in the US, in China, more developed markets, and in Europe, for example, how that actually is relevant to Singapore and the region, and how actually do we take that technology or policy implementation and make it relevant for, I think, for us in Singapore particularly.
Thanks for that overview, Andy. Now, of course, when we talk about Asia or even just ASEAN is extremely different and fragmented one from another. In your experience as head of media and tech at Goldman Sachs, do you see a huge difference? Maybe walk us through some of the big differences amongst the different markets in ASEAN in terms of the adoption of tech in the landscape or in the space of mobility.
Sure. So actually, I think you raised a good point. And fortunately, unfortunately for us in ASEAN, people tend to confuse us as one region, but it is one region with, call it 10 countries, right? That's right. We don't enjoy the benefits of a single market dynamics that we see in the US, China, and India, for example. And so, even getting, consistency around adoption and policies, regulations, use cases, every market has different evolutions around mobility. I would say probably in kind of my standpoint, maybe the most kind of forward-leaning and advanced right now in terms of mobility, tends to be, the more developed markets in ASEAN, right? So Singapore obviously is at top of that list. We've seen in terms of dynamism in Indonesia, for example, Malaysia as well. I think those are priorities. Thailand and Vietnam as well continues to be very focused around innovation and mobility, but I would say that's from a more of a policy standpoint of view rather than technology. And the rest and Philippines as well, I think I would put in the bucket. And the rest, I think the Indo-China countries are still, I think, catching up, but I think they're making good tracks in terms of innovation and mobility and kind of getting people to actually adopt tech-enabled, I would say, mobility.
So it sounds like, of course, we started with the more developed countries in Southeast
Yeah.
Asia when perhaps early explorations, mobility inventions were a little bit pricier. But would you say that now we're kind of at a bit more of a tipping point where things are a bit more affordable and adoption can be more scalable, even in markets that have perhaps less purchasing power?
I agree. And maybe to clarify and refine that, then there are different parts of mobility, right? So let's just talk about the bracket cheaper pieces or more consumer accessible parts of mobility. So in more of the emerging markets in ASEAN, then yes, products like you see in Grab, Gojek, ride sharing, a lot of these kind of that impacts, I would say, user behavior type mobility are becoming more prevalent. I think that, and yes, like to your point, cost is a thing. It's a key proposition around pushing adoption for ride sharing, for example. The flip side is the more innovative and more advanced technologies like LiDAR, EVs, things like that. That tends to be more of a more developed market play for now, given the high cost adoption. It is still scaling up. But am I bullish that in the future, more emerging markets in ASEAN kind of adopt EV or kind of LiDAR, autonomous driving, and things like that? I think the answer is yes.
Well, so I think what we're hearing is that really the different tiers of adoption initially, but eventually they might converge, and who knows, some of the other markets might leapfrog the early adopters. Now, changing tack, earlier you mentioned Indonesia being a very vibrant market, and I think many would agree that besides business and private sector push, government legislation frameworks are equally critical. So what are some key legislations that need to happen, perhaps to speed up the adoption of mobility? Or adoption of these technologies in a scalable manner?
So I think a couple of things, and I still, if you ask me, the most draconian or in some ways the most effective, where we've seen has been around actually the phasing out of petrol and diesel cars, for example, right? And the UK is a good example where you set certain targets. And that one obviously drives a lot of climate change and electrification of cars. But things like policies like that, I think, will be quite innovative and in terms of actually setting up a framework for kind of changing the dynamics around mobility. The other one where we've seen been kind of being very constructive is, quite candidly, everyone I think has adopted the shared economy concept for ride hailing, for transportation and things like that. So as we think about mobility as well, are there regulations that support that? So that includes, how do you actually make ride sharing, for example, legal, which is I think still illegal in some countries, for example. How do you actually support driver safety? How do you actually support the contractual obligations around drivers and things like that? I think those are, in my mind, some key legislations that will be helpful to actually showcase or kind of highlight to the market what the ultimate business model looks like for new forms of mobility.
It's great that you mentioned that, because there is a bit of a delicate balance. I do remember that when I was in a certain Southeast Asian country, we had to hail our Grab secretively because otherwise they might get beaten up by the local taxi drivers.
That's correct.
So how do we get governments to maybe legislate? Which countries perhaps have been successful in legislating and striking a good balance between protecting local jobs or current existing jobs and making the way, paving the way for modern technologies to be embraced?
Okay. So I want to be balanced here. Is, in my mind, policies in terms of implementation, in some ways, there's always going to be winners and losers. So from my perspective, I think clarity of the policy implementation, what the policy is, rather than talking about more of the objectives, in some ways is more constructive for the capital markets, investors, or even adoption of technology itself.
Right.
And a lot of times, I feel like the pitfalls in terms of regulations is governments really want to innovate, governments really want to drive policy, but what's very gray is the execution and the objectives, because there are a lot of stakeholders that are trying to check the boxes for, right? So I would say, clarity in that mind, where markets have done very well with kind of objectives around that. I think the US, for example, even in Singapore, I think there has been very strong clarity of what regulations are and should be, and how that is being implemented. So I feel like that is actually more important in some ways, rather than saying that we need X amount of regulations to get to an objective that we want to achieve.
Absolutely. So it's not really for legislating's sake, but really making sure they're clear about where they want to end up. And I suppose, like you said, aligning the incentives along the way as well, so execution
Correct.
happens.
Yeah.
Now,
That's right.
moving tech towards actual investments, and of course, you're coming from the IB division at Goldman Sachs.
Mm-hmm.
Share with us, from the perspective of institutional investments into startups in the mobility sector, have you seen a shift over the last few years?
We've seen a shift quite dramatically, I would say, but I would say more around the type of assets in mobility that investors are interested in. Mm-hmm. So to be clear, I do not see a lack of capital or investors wanting to invest in mobility as a whole. I would say it's still pretty robust. We have a lot of capital sitting on the sidelines looking for the next big thing in mobility. That said, I think, historically, if you look through what has kind of transcended the last few years, people started in mobility there's a large amount of attention on, for example, ride sharing again, right? Everyone was investing in the next ride hailing for cars, for, scooters, bicycles, and things like that evolved into, food delivery. I include that as mobility as well, services based. Mm-hmm. I do think that where the market is right now is looking for the next thing in terms of less around business balls, but more around technology innovation. So top of mind, and for example, is same thing, electrification of cars. So a lot of investment we see in EVs. Autonomous driving tends to be a large kind of focus around investors. So you see a lot of LiDAR companies again. And I think what's interesting here is, and we've seen this in other sectors, is a pivot away from more consumer-facing type technology. So, for example, we talk about EVs, and we did the IPOs for Li Auto and NIO, and for example, a lot more focus now is on the commercial side. So that's again an example of the kind of where the market is evolving, right? So start with electric cars, now it's more electric trucks, electric vans. And that's because people are focused around the enterprise or commercial fleets, which in some ways is still relatively under-tapped, but that's kind of where the next sectors are going.
And that's something that you're personally looking into as well at Goldman Sachs?
I think we are looking at commercial, So there's, as a firm, and where a lot of the activity is, commercial, consumer electric cars, yes, done quite a bit of that continues to be hot, everyone's focus. Where the recent more innovative stuff has been around, batteries, for example, electric trucks, charging networks, things like that, I think are coming to market. And that will be, I think, quite interesting.
So really moving away from B2C type technologies to B2B, how do you use those to transform your industrial commercial activity?
That's correct.
Right. Sounds very much like what GoBell is doing. I suppose right. That's why you're working closely with them.
Yes.
Well, moving on, since you did mention about IPO earlier, what are some of the companies that Goldman Sachs has successfully IPO'd, and what made them successful in your mind?
So some of the IPO names that we took to public, and I profess a lot of the IPOs are more weighted towards cars right now. Mm-hmm. Same thing, I think, is a function of the market, right? So Tesla is obviously, top of mind for a lot of people. We took that public. NIO in China, Li Auto in China, we took the companies public. So that's kind of then one bucket. Then from a pivot a bit from a market capital standpoint, we have done offerings for BYD as well in China. The other one that on the commercial side may be interesting is we sold a company called XOX, which does commercial trucks to a SPAC. So now a lot of another thematic that I kind of talk about is a lot of things related to mobility are accessing the public markets much earlier because there's also specs that they can kind of take public, become a public company as well. And so Voita, which is a charging network, that was something that we sold to a spec as well. We raised a Series D for them. So, so there are a bunch of other companies that have gone public indirectly through a spec as well that we helped on.
So would we be right to say that maybe a lot of these mobility companies, they would have just done it privately previously, having seen some successful IPOs now, they're a little bit encouraged, and so they are venturing into this space earlier on as well?
That's correct, yeah. So the debate we always have for companies is whether go public early or remain private, right? I would say it's both works, right? There is a lot of capital on the private side. Same thing, there is a lot of capital on the public side as well. It's just a function of what do kind of founders want to achieve by raising capital.
That's true. And what are the trade-offs involved?
That's right.
Don't like to talk about those.
Yeah.
Right. A broader question to end off, because we have a lot of people in the audience, right, from businesses to startups. What are the key success criterion for getting funded?
So I'm a bit more idealistic. I will start with that first. So, ultimately, in terms of funding, and ultimately its key is the founder itself has a vision around what he wants to achieve and where this business evolves into the next 10, 20 years. Right. So you gotta be, because as we think about disruption and innovation, a lot of times people don't really know, what the future holds, and it's up to the founder to kind of drive their vision. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I think it's key in my mind, especially in the context of ASEAN, and being pragmatic, is there's not a lot of technological innovation. It's really around execution more than anything else. And so in terms of ability to get funding, it's a clear vision plus being able to have a strong management team to actually execute in terms of the business plan that's being developed. And the last thing I would say in terms of funding is every round impacts the next round. Where we've seen a lot of high growth tech companies trip themselves is they haven't been very thoughtful around the sequence of funding and the size of the funding. For example, if someone shows up with a check, they need the capital, they take it. I think I would encourage founders to be very thoughtful around the right side of funding versus the life cycle of where the business is today, and right size the funding amount and not take money, for example, too much upfront.
I don't think those are phenomenal tips there. So really, founder matters first and foremost, the execution, the strength of the management team, and finally, let's not be greedy. Money always comes with strings attached. So to right size and sequence it well. Thank you so much, Andy. I think this is really exciting. We look forward to a lot more of what Goldman Sachs and other companies like yourself will be doing in the mobility space, and we'll be sure to watch it for B2B commercial type asset investments. Thank you once again, Andy. It's been a pleasure.
No problem.